Hi, welcome to the review for prehistory slash early world. Let's get started. From our timeline, because we're going to look at the 12 periods of Bible history very briefly, but the most time that we'll take is in prehistory in the book of Genesis, because the beginning of a story has a lot to do with the end of the story. So I've already given you these specific Bible passages to put in. And so let's begin with the creation of the universe. God has two problems to solve: tohu wabahu, or formlessness and emptiness. So days 1 through 3 solve the problem of formlessness. God begins by separating things. Kind of like if you're building a house, your first step is to separate the outside from the inside. And you do that by creating walls. And so God, day 1, day 2, and day 3, in the process of separation, creates time. It's for the T right there. Creates space. That's on day 2, separating the waters above and the waters below, and a habitat by drawing out land from the waters. And then days 4 through 6, God re-enters the solution to formlessness, and he now begins to work on the problem of emptiness. So on day 4, he places within the light and the dark, the sun and the moon. On days 5, he goes back into day 2 and he creates like aquatic creatures and birds of the sky. And then on day 6, on the habitat he made, he begins to fill it up with animals and eventually people, the high point of his creation. And then he calls Adam and Eve to leave day 6, to leave the idea of just being a creature or a beast, and to enter into a new relationship with him on day 7, the Sabbath. Moving from day 6 to day 7 is a covenant where people enter into a family relationship, and God invites them, and through them, all of creation, into a kind of relationship with their creator that goes beyond being creator and creature. Adam and Eve are allowed to enter into a relationship where they become sons and daughters of God, family. And so that happens on the Sabbath. And remember, this story of Genesis was circulated often during the Israelite slavery in Egypt, as a reminder that you are not how much you produce or what you make. Your value is not in what you do, but it's in who you belong to. Okay, let's go to the next one. Creation of man. This is what we did on Monday. Adam is created with privileges of sonship, kingship, priesthood, prophethood, and to be a bridegroom. The image of sonship is the radiating light reflecting off of his face. He images his father, God. He is called to be a king, to have dominion over everything in the garden and everything in creation. That means that he's going to have a responsibility, a task placed on him to do something, to take what's happening in the garden and expand it into all of creation. Next is priesthood. And in this scenario, the priest has a job to protect the meeting place between God and man. And I gave the example of very much like as a priest in my home, I have a job to protect the meeting place of God and man. That's my relation with my wife and my children. It's to guard that, because there are things outside of my relationships that are not good, that want to steal what we have as a family. And so my job is to be able to make sacrifices to defend my family. And then prophethood, and that's the open mouth. The priesthood is the shawl. The prophethood is the open mouth, being able to proclaim truth. Namely, that has to do with naming. In Genesis chapter 2, Adam is invited to name animals who are God's creation. Mankind, Adam, is invited to name them, kind of God's way of saying, even though I have the right to name what I create, I'm going to let you share in this privilege to speak on my behalf. And then the last one is bridegroom, when Adam realizes that nothing in creation can ever satisfy him or help him fulfill God's destiny, his destiny that God gave him, which is to image God to all of creation. Adam is put to sleep, and out of that slumber, he wakes up and there's his bride, someone who is not meant to be used, not meant to be beneath him or above him, but to meant someone who's absolutely necessary for him to accomplish God's purpose. And only together can they do this. Show the world what it looks like to receive love, to be loved, and to give love in a way that changes everything outside of the garden to look like the garden. And in the garden is where man and God meet. So those privileges are given to him, and each of these little icons reveal that privilege. So the crown and the scepter are images of his kingship. The sun is the rays of light. The open mouth is the prophet. The priest is the shawl. And the bridegroom is the ring on his finger. These are the same privileges that all of us have in our baptism. We'll get to that later. Next is the Edenic covenant. That's the picture of the mountain. And the meeting place between God and man, a place where Adam and Eve are called to eat of all the fruits except for that one. And that one tree called the knowledge of good and evil, that's the tree that God says not to eat from. Not because knowledge is bad, but because the word knowledge is experience. There are some experiences that when you enter into them, they harm you, they kill you, they destroy you. So when God says don't eat of that tree, what he's saying is there are some things about good and evil that you have to trust me as your good father to tell you about. Like with my children, me telling them not to run across the street because they can get hurt. They have to trust me in order to listen to that, because they don't have proof that what I tell them will happen. And if they wanted to have experiential knowledge, one, it means that they don't want to trust me, and two, that experiential knowledge in learning it could kill them. So God says, trust me, I'm good, and I'll tell you what you need to know. And then there's another tree called the tree of life. Between these two trees, Eve is confronted by a Nahash or Nashash, a dragon leviathan. And she is tempted and seduced. She's tempted to question God's love. Like a kid who begins to wonder, does dad give me all these rules because he loves me or because he doesn't want me to have good things? And so she reaches out because she believes the lie of the devil. The lie is that if she eats of this fruit, that she's going to be like God. That's the irony, because if you go back to my previous slide, they are already created in his image and likeness. So the lie takes what God already wants to do for them and makes them want to do it for themselves. They think that if they experience things on their own, then they don't need God. And so where's Adam? When the threat approaches Eve, Adam remains behind her. The scripture says she turns and gives him the fruit. He's silent. He's a coward. The first Adam, the first man, he has a responsibility. Remember? Part of it is to guard and protect his family, to extend God's kingdom, to speak truth, to image God's love, and to be a bridegroom. If someone threatens your bride in any way, you stand between her and the threat. You may not be able to stop the threat, but you better try. You better at least die trying. And maybe that's why he stood behind her. He chose to be selfish instead of to be self-sacrificing. That, if you take a quick jump all the way to Jesus, Jesus is called by the early church the new Adam, or the second Adam, because he, fully human being, experiences that level of temptation and anxiety and fear for his life. The serpent again tempts him in the Garden of Eden before he goes to the cross. The temptation is the knowledge of what's about to happen. You stand up to the devil, you're going to die. And Jesus, fully God, fully man, experiences the same human response that Adam did, that any of us would in the face of death, which is, I don't want to die. And the battle is in his will. Like, I may not want something, but I know what I need to do. I love my bride. For Adam, it was Eve. And for Jesus, it's the church. So Jesus sweats blood as he fights this internal battle between his body and his soul, between knowing what he ought to do and what his body is telling him to do, which is run. And he overcomes what Adam couldn't overcome. As a full human being, Jesus shows us it's possible with God's help. And then he goes to the cross. This is the cool thing. The early church called the cross the tree of life. And there's this great scene in the Passion of Christ where Jesus is on the Via Dolorosa carrying his cross, knowing where it's leading him, and he's holding onto it tightly. And his mom breaks through the crowd, runs to him, and he says to her, "See, mother, I make all things new." Jesus, by running to the cross, the tree of life, gives us life, not running away from it. And let's talk about Mary. The first Eve, through an encounter with an angel, a fallen angel, Satan, she makes a free choice to listen to a lie and take something for herself. Mary's considered the new Eve. She's sinless. An angel approaches her, and she is invited not to take, but to receive. Free choice. When Mary says yes to God's proposal, she receives life, life itself, Jesus, and she bears him into this world. So the first Eve brings death, the new Eve brings life. Okay. Eden is a mountaintop, so Mount Eden, the mediator of God's plan, covenant, family relationship is Adam, and the structure or the form of the covenant is marriage. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So here are the covenant blessings. In a God-centered world, we have a perfect relationship with God where we receive sanctifying grace. It just means we have something more than nature could give us. Everything in nature is a creature, part of creation. But creation has no rights to its creator. But a son or a daughter has certain rights to their parent. God pulls us into a covenant relationship. And that means that we have certain rights as children to call out to God and expect that he would answer. They had a perfect relationship with themselves, harmony of their soul and their body, which meant that they had preternatural gifts. Like when your soul and your body are unified, when there isn't this battle of your will between wanting to do the right thing and not being able to go through with it, or wanting to avoid a bad thing but still being tempted by it, you have a harmony. They had preternatural gifts that came from before nature. Because they were in a perfect relation with God, they didn't experience suffering, they didn't experience sickness, and they didn't experience death. Suffering, sickness, and death are never from God. He didn't create them. He didn't want them for us. Like, what father would want that for his kids? God does it. We had a perfect relation with others, marked by purity and joy. Adam and Eve understood who they were, who each other were, and they saw the beauty in each other. There was no illusion to their bodies. They knew what their bodies were beautiful, created in God's image. They knew what it was for, to be able to reflect God. So there's purity and joy. That means we imaged God himself. Lastly, a relation with God, self, and others meant that we had a perfect relationship with nature, the natural world around us, the physical world. When we planted things, things grew, because we had an understanding of whose the world was. The world, it belongs to God, and God shared it with us and told us to treat the world the way that he would. So we became stewards. Stewards are people who take care of someone else's possession the way that they would take care of it. So the natural world cooperated with us. The weather, the environment, in the garden, everything was in harmony. And Adam and Eve's job together was to take what was happening in the garden, beginning in them with God, and expanding it to the rest of creation. And then they fell into sin. This is very straightforward. Only write down what's in the bold. The rest is just to help. Adam and Eve were tempted to doubt God's goodness, assume that God was holding back. They were then tempted to break their relationship with God. Don't trust him. Do the very thing he expressly said don't do. Assume he told you not to do it because he's holding back on you. Then Adam and Eve were seduced by their desire. The temptation had to be something that they wanted for it to be temptation. They wanted to be like God, and so they were tempted by the very thing that God wanted for them. Right? Here's an example. My daughter wants to drive. I want her to drive, but it has to be in my way, my time. Because if she were to sneak out and try to drive the car at 5, she would get hurt. But because I have rules for how she'll learn, if she were to doubt my goodness, she would think those rules are to keep her from learning. So God's plan was, 1, to put a desire in her heart to be like him. 2, to satisfy that desire on his terms. Not because he's mean, but because he knows exactly how to make that desire grow. And then when we fell into the lie, we chose the gift over the giver. And in choosing the gift over the giver, not only did we lose our relationship with the giver, but we also lose the gift that we desperately wanted, the gift that God wanted to give us, which is to be like him, full of the destiny of loving one another, being loved, and then taking that reality out into the world and changing the rest of creation so that it looks like the garden. Like my kids, my job as a parent is to love them and to love their wife, their mom, my wife, so that when they go out into the world, when they leave the garden of my home, they become people who change their environment, not people who get changed by their environment. So they fell into sin. They broke their relationship with God. That's called original sin. They broke their relationship with themselves. They lost that harmony, which means they began to experience suffering, sickness, death, and pain. They broke their relation with others. Human relations are marked by lust and domination and mistrust and envy. That's why Adam and Eve, the first thing they did when they fell out of relation with God, they clothed themselves, because they realized that now they can take advantage of each other. And they lost their relation with nature. Now you can spend all day working out in the fields and nature doesn't have to respond. You could experience drought and famine and pestilence. You could misuse nature. You could exploit it. You could suffer from things that are outside of your control, hurricanes, tsunamis, floods. It's like when we broke our relation with God, everything else after that was broken too. So consequences and the remedy. The consequences of the fall today. These are all things you should be writing down. We inherited through our birth everything that Adam gave to us. We inherit as human beings things that Adam gave to us. We inherited a wounded human nature. We're not wretched, but we're wounded. That means that we can do great things as easily as we can do pretty horrific things. We can stay afloat, but ultimately you can only float for a while before you sink. Human beings can do good, but not for very long, and not without great, effort. And even then, it kind of falls apart. We have concupiscence, meaning we're weirdly attracted to things that we know are bad for us. So what's the remedy? In Jesus, we can have a new inheritance. So in Adam, we inherit problems that we didn't cause. In Jesus, we can inherit solutions that we can't cause either. All we can do is receive it. In our baptism, we're given back our sonship, or the image and likeness that God gave us, that privilege. In our baptism, we're given new privileges of Adam. We're given back those 5 privileges of Adam. We're again given the ability to image God, to expand God's dominion, to increase love, the kind of love that God has for us that changes the world. We're given back our sense of priesthood to be able to offer sacrifice on behalf of ourselves and others. We're given back our privilege of prophethood to speak truth and watch things change, and the sense of being a bridegroom, an intimacy with the Father. We don't get back preternatural gifts. There's still sickness, suffering, and death. But the more we live out our privileges, the more sickness, suffering, and death kind of fall away and change before us. So remember Jesus? He is the perfect son, the perfect king, the perfect priest, the perfect prophet. He's the perfect bridegroom. And when he does those things perfectly, he heals the sick, and he raises the dead, right? He did it for us, so we know what we're called to do. And through grace, we can fight against concupiscence, that dumb desire to do stupid things even when we know they're stupid. All right. Transmission of original sin. Pretty much, I just want you to write these two things down. Original sin is Adam's sin. He committed a personal sin, Adam and Eve. They committed a personal sin. It's not our fault, but it's our problem. We didn't commit their sin, they did. But if your parents gambled away all of their money and went into massive debt because they're your parents, it's not your fault, but it's your problem. Because they're our parents through nature, what they left for us is a debt that we cannot pay. So we inherited a problem. We didn't commit it, but it was transmitted to us in virtue of just being a human being. So what now can happen is through Jesus, we can inherit something new that could pay off that debt and give us something that we would never have had apart from him. Okay, I'm going to skip the rest here. Let's look back where we're at. Let's talk about the curse and the promise. Genesis 3:15 is the key verse. After the fall, God encounters them and makes a promise. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. Meaning, between Eve's future offspring and the offspring of the serpent, the devil, it's going to be like there's going to be two lines of people, two family cultures. And one family culture is going to strive to make a name for God. And God's going to defend and protect them so that someday that family will give birth to a Savior. And there will be another family culture that will be marked by violence, all kinds of sexual misconduct and abuse. And that family culture will try to make a name for themselves through greed and through power and through whatever means necessary. And these two family cultures will be at war. And the offspring, Jesus, will crush the head of the serpent someday, while the serpent bites the heel of the one who destroys it. And there's the image of Jesus, who in conquering the devil, allows the devil to think he won. The devil bites him, poisons him, kills him. The devil thinks he wins, not realizing that the very act of putting Jesus to the death is how Jesus wins.